Marriage is a strange thing. 15 years in, you think you know a person like the back of your hand. Evelyn had always been the center of my world. Graceful, sharp, the kind of woman who could command a room with nothing more than a smile. She had this air of sophistication about her, an effortless charm that I fell for the moment we met. But lately, that charm felt hollow, like a mask she wore, one that cracked a little more every time she walked through the door late at night. It started with small things. A missed dinner here, a vague excuse there. Work ran late, she'd say, or had to stop by a client's place. Her stories were always delivered with that polished confidence, but something felt off. She'd never been one for perfume, yet I noticed new scents clinging to her clothes. And then there was her wedding ring, subtle changes in how she wore it. Sometimes it sat backward, with the diamonds pressed into her palm. It was an odd little detail, but one that gnawed at me. I'm not proud of what I did next, but doubt makes you desperate. I hired a private investigator. A man I trusted. Someone who understood discretion. Follow her, I said. Don't miss a thing. For weeks, I heard nothing. I almost convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe I was just paranoid, jealous of her demanding career and the time it stole from us. But then, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, the investigator called. His voice was measured but carried an edge of urgency. I've got something you'll want to see. I agreed to meet him that evening, my heart pounding like a drum the entire day. When I arrived at his office, he handed me a thick envelope. Inside were photographs. Evelyn laughing in a cozy little cafe with a man I didn't recognize. Another of them walking arm in arm along a quiet street. And then the worst of all, the two of them stepping into a boutique hotel, the kind with too much brass and velvet for its own good. I didn't cry. Not yet. Anger has a way of numbing you, wrapping itself around your heart like armor. I sat there, staring at those pictures, feeling like the ground had been yanked out from under me. This wasn't just some harmless flirtation. Evelyn was cheating on me. The investigator cleared his throat. There's more, if you're ready to hear it. More. Of course, there was more. I told the investigator to give me everything he had. Every detail, every time and date, no matter how small or ugly. If Evelyn had been lying to me, I needed to know how deep her betrayal ran. The truth came in fragments, each one sharper than the last. Her work dinners were a smokescreen, perfectly timed with her lover's movements. His name was Leo Grayson, a name that now felt like poison on my tongue. He wasn't just anyone, though. He was one of her colleagues, someone she'd mentioned before in passing. Leo's brilliant, she'd said once. He's got a real knack for strategy. I remember nodding, oblivious to the layers beneath her words. The more I learned, the more I noticed the cracks in her stories. The new designer heels I hadn't seen her wear at home. The last-minute spa days that always left her glowing. Even her phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, was now a permanent fixture in her handbag. Password protected, of course. I decided to test the waters that evening. I'd seen her lies in pictures, but I wanted to hear them straight from her mouth. When she walked through the door, carrying a sleek black clutch, I was waiting in the living room. She looked surprised to see me, but her expression softened quickly. "Hey, you're home early," she said, leaning in for a kiss that I barely returned. She pulled back, giving me a puzzled look. "Long day?" "You could say that," I replied, my voice deliberately neutral. "How was yours?" Her answer came too fast, too smooth. Exhausting. Back-to-back meetings. And then I had to stop by a client's office. "You know how it is." I nodded slowly, watching her closely. She dropped her bag on the counter, kicked off her heels, and poured herself a glass of wine. Everything about her was practiced, like a performance she'd rehearsed 100 times. And maybe she had. "I thought we could have dinner together," I said. "It's been a while since we've had a proper night in." Evelyn smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That sounds nice, but I'm beat." Rain check. Rain check. That word had started to feel like her mantra. Always a reason, always a delay. I watched as she retreated to the bedroom, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. When the door closed behind her, I pulled out my own phone. The investigator had sent me more than just photos. There were videos, timestamps, even transcripts of texts between her and Leo. I scrolled through them, feeling the anger in my chest start to bubble over. Her messages were coy, flirtatious, full of inside jokes I didn't understand. She'd built a world with him, a world where I didn't exist. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I stared at the ceiling and made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her just yet. No, I wanted to see how far she'd go, how many lies she'd tell, before I ripped her perfect little world apart. The days that followed were a study in restraint. Every time Evelyn smiled at me or kissed my cheek, I felt the sting of betrayal. But I played my part. A loving husband, none the wiser. The truth was, I was already putting the pieces in place for her reckoning. Evelyn had no idea I'd started tracking her. I wasn't proud of it, but pride had nothing to do with this anymore. A tiny GPS device slipped into her favorite handbag, a silent companion that told me exactly where she went. I synced her phone to a monitoring app I downloaded, one that mirrored her texts and calls. It wasn't hard. She'd left her phone unlocked once during dinner, distracted by a notification. What I saw only confirmed my suspicions. The texts between her and Leo weren't just flirtatious, they were detailed. Plans for secret meetings, inside jokes about me, even complaints about how boring our marriage had become. I had to stop reading at one point, the bile rising in my throat. But what struck me most was how brazen she was. It wasn't just about sneaking around. She seemed to enjoy it, the thrill of deception. It wasn't enough to be unfaithful. She needed to rub salt in the wound, even if I didn't know it yet. One text stood out. "He's so clueless." Honestly, I'm not even sure he'd notice if I walked out one day. That was the moment I decided to act. I started with the house. Evelyn had always insisted on handling the design and decor, filling every corner with carefully curated luxury. But I had my own touch to add now. Cameras. Discreet, well-placed devices in the rooms she frequented most. The living room, the bedroom, even her dressing area. They weren't for voyeurism or curiosity. They were my insurance, my silent witnesses. Next came the evidence. The photos, the videos, the texts, they were all compiled into a neat little package. A flash drive, labeled and ready to go. I made copies, of course. One for me, one for her, and a few others for the people who mattered most in our world. Evelyn had built her reputation on being untouchable, flawless. It was time to introduce a little chaos. But I didn't want to rush. This wasn't just about exposing her lies, it was about letting her feel the weight of her choices. I began planting seeds of doubt in her mind, subtle at first. A comment here, a knowing glance there. I'd leave my laptop open to an innocuous-looking email about a security upgrade, or casually mention how I'd been thinking about installing cameras for peace of mind. She noticed, of course. Evelyn was no fool. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, she turned to me with that practiced smile of hers. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "You've been different lately." I looked at her, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. "Just work stress," I said finally. "Nothing to worry about." Her eyes searched mine, but she couldn't see the storm brewing beneath the surface. I knew she'd be meeting Leo that Friday. Her texts had told me as much. I made sure my schedule was clear, even mentioning that I'd be tied up at the office late. She didn't ask questions, just gave me a distracted nod before disappearing into the bedroom. As I watched her pack her things the next morning, humming softly to herself, I felt an odd sense of calm. She thought she was in control, playing me like one of her little games. But Friday wasn't just her meeting with Leo. It was the beginning of the end. Friday came, and Evelyn was radiant. She spent more time getting ready than usual, her reflection glowing in the mirror as she carefully applied her makeup. She had a new dress, red, sleek, the kind that made people turn their heads. Her hair was styled just enough to look effortless, and her perfume lingered in the air long after she left the room. Watching her felt surreal, like observing a stranger playing dress-up in my wife's skin. "You're working late tonight, right?" she asked casually over breakfast, her tone light, as though the answer didn't matter. "Yeah, big case," I said, not looking up from my phone. "Should be home by 10 or so." She smiled, sipping her coffee. "Don't work too hard." I wanted to laugh. Hard work wasn't on her agenda today. But I kept my composure, even kissed her cheek before leaving the table. My calmness was starting to rattle her, I could tell. She kept glancing at me, as if searching for cracks in my facade. I gave her none. When she finally left the house, dressed to kill and clutching her favorite bag, I tracked her movements on my phone. As expected, the GPS pinged from the boutique hotel downtown. Suite 2309, just like her text with Leo had said. It almost felt too easy. But I wasn't going to storm in and confront them, not yet. There was more to do, and I needed Evelyn to think she'd gotten away with it. At 7 p.m., I made my move. While Evelyn was with Leo, I returned home and got to work. The box was ready, a white gift box tied with a crimson silk ribbon. Inside was everything: the photos, the flash drive, and a few choice extras. A one-way ticket to Granite Falls, her sleepy little hometown, was tucked in for good measure. I added a printed email exchange from her office HR team, detailing the consequences of inappropriate relationships in the workplace. A subtle hint of what was coming. The final touch was a single piece of paper on top of it all. No explanation, just one sentence. You thought I wouldn't notice. By the time Evelyn returned home, it was close to midnight. I deliberately left the house dimly lit, the glow from the dining room casting soft shadows across the marble floor. I sat on the couch with a glass of whiskey, the gift box sitting on the table like a silent guest. She froze when she saw me, her heels clicking to a stop. "You're still up." "Couldn't sleep," I said, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. My tone was calm, almost bored. Her eyes darted to the box, curiosity flickering across her face. She was good at hiding her nerves, but not good enough. "What's that?" she asked, gesturing toward it. "A surprise," I said, standing and gesturing for her to sit. "For you." Evelyn hesitated, then walked toward the table. She set her clutch down, her fingers trembling slightly as she untied the ribbon. The lid came off, and for a moment, she just stared at the contents. Her face drained of color. What is this?" I didn't answer. I just leaned against the wall, watching her unravel. Evelyn's hands shook as she flipped through the glossy photographs, each one exposing her carefully crafted web of deceit. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the rustle of paper and the faint hum of the refrigerator. She stared at a picture of herself with Leo, her arm casually draped over his shoulder, a carefree smile on her face. This isn't what it looks like," she stammered, looking up at me. Her voice was thin, desperate, like a cornered animal. "Isn't it?" I said, folding my arms. "Because it looks pretty clear to me. You, Leo, his car, that hotel suite. Should I keep going?" Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something. An excuse, an escape, anything. "You don't understand, Marcus," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think. He's just a friend. Those pictures are. They're taken out of context." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Context? Sure, let's talk about context. Like the texts I've seen, the calls you've made, the meetings you've had. Tell me, Evelyn, is just a friend code for someone you sleep with when your husband's working late?" Her face flushed, a mix of anger and panic. "You've been spying on me," she snapped, as if she were the victim here. "That's an invasion of my privacy. I can't believe you." "Don't," I interrupted sharply, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Don't you dare try to turn this on me. I'm not the one sneaking around, lying, and tearing this marriage apart." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, her mind clearly racing to find an angle that might work. Finally, she dropped the photos back into the box and folded her arms, her voice icy. "Fine. You want the truth?" "Yes, I've been seeing Leo. But do you know why, Marcus? Do you? Because you've been absent for years. You're so wrapped up in your work, in your routines, that you didn't even notice when I started drifting away. I needed something you couldn't give me anymore. Attention, excitement." Her words hit me like a slap, but I refused to flinch. "So this is my fault?" I said, my voice steady but laced with fury. "You chose to betray me, to humiliate me, and now you want to blame me for it?" "I'm not blaming you," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm just saying, things weren't perfect. And maybe if you'd been more present, more—" "Stop," I said, holding up a hand. "You don't get to rewrite history here. I've been nothing but supportive of you. Your career, your dreams, everything. I've given you everything, Evelyn. And this is how you repay me. Her mask cracked for the first time. Her defiance gave way to something raw, something vulnerable. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. I didn't. I got lost. I wanted to believe her, to see the woman I once loved beneath the lies. But the damage was done, and her crocodile tears weren't going to fix it. Well, I said, my voice cold, you're about to find out what lost really looks like. I pointed to the box. Take a good, long look at that, Evelyn. Because it's just the beginning. Evelyn sat frozen, her fingers trembling over the box, her tear-streaked face a mix of fear and disbelief. She was used to control, to manipulation, always one step ahead. But now, she was scrambling, and I wasn't done yet. I grabbed the remote and pressed a button. The massive OLED screen on the wall came to life, playing a video from the flash drive I'd left in the box. Security footage filled the room. Evelyn and Leo in a hotel suite, sitting too close, whispering, laughing. Then, the unmistakable moment where her lips met his. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Marcus, please. I didn't respond, letting the video play on. It wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. It showed everything I needed her to see, and everything she couldn't deny. When the screen went dark, I turned to her. Still want to tell me it's out of context? She dropped her gaze, her silence speaking louder than any excuse she could have come up with. For a moment, I felt a pang of something. Pity, maybe? No. That wasn't it. It was the sting of knowing the woman I loved had become someone I didn't recognize. I'm sorry, she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean to hurt you. I laughed, bitter and sharp. Didn't mean to hurt me? Evelyn, this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was deliberate. Every text, every meeting, every lie, you made those choices. And now you want forgiveness. Her eyes flashed with something. Pride, anger, shame, I couldn't tell. What do you want me to say, Marcus? That I'm a horrible person? That I ruined everything? Fine. I'll say it. But you weren't exactly perfect either. There it was again, her need to deflect, to spread the blame. But I wasn't taking the bait. This isn't about me, I said firmly. It's about what you did, and what happens next. Evelyn looked up, her expression a mix of confusion and dread. Next? What do you mean? I gestured to the box. Let's start with the evidence. You see, Evelyn, I didn't just gather it for myself. I've sent copies to a few key people. Our closest friends, some of your colleagues, and even Leo's wife. Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You didn't. I did, I said simply. By now, they've all seen what you've been up to. You built your life on appearances, Evelyn, and I'm pulling back the curtain. Her hands clenched into fists. How could you do this? You're ruining me. I stepped closer, my voice low but steady. No. Evelyn. You ruined yourself. I'm just making sure you face the consequences. She stood abruptly, pacing the room. This isn't fair, Marcus. You don't know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel trapped in. Invisible? I interrupted, my voice rising. You had everything, Evelyn. A husband who adored you, a life most people dream of. And you threw it away for what? A fling? Some thrill? She didn't answer, just stood there, her head bowed. I could see her trying to think, trying to calculate her next move. But there was nothing left to manipulate, no card she could play. You wanted freedom, didn't you? I said, my tone cold. Well, now you have it. No friends, no reputation, no safety net. Just you and the ashes of everything you destroyed. Evelyn sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. For the first time, she seemed truly defeated. But I didn't feel victorious. Not yet. There was more to come. Much more. Evelyn sat motionless, her head in her hands, as though hiding from the reality I had laid bare. The weight of her actions was finally pressing down on her, but I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. You think this is over, don't you? I said, pacing slowly around the room. You think you can cry, apologize, and somehow patch this up. But it's not that simple, Evelyn. Actions have consequences. And yours are just beginning. She looked up, her face pale and streaked with tears. Marcus, please. Don't do this. We can fix this. I'll end it with Leo. I'll do whatever it takes. Fix it. I stopped and turned to face her. You can't unring this bell, Evelyn. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed us. Our marriage, our life, everything we built together. And you expect me to believe this sudden remorse is anything more than fear of what's coming. She flinched at my words but didn't reply. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I'll make it easy for you, I continued. Your job? Gone. I've already sent the evidence to your HR department. They have strict policies about workplace relationships, don't they? You'll be lucky to leave with a reference. Her eyes widened, panic setting in. You can't do that. My career. Your career. I cut her off. The one you jeopardized for a fling? Don't act like a victim now. You made this bed, Evelyn. She stood abruptly, her fists clenched. You don't understand what it's like to be me, Marcus. To live in your shadow, to always feel like I'm just an accessory in your life. I laughed, shaking my head. An accessory? Is that what you think? Evelyn, you had everything. I never held you back. I supported you, even when it meant putting my own dreams on hold. And this is how you repay me, by running to some junior analyst because you felt unimportant. Her anger deflated as quickly as it had flared, leaving her looking small and unsure. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she whispered again, her voice cracking. I didn't. I leaned in closer, my tone cold and measured. But it did. And now Leo's wife knows. She's already filed for divorce, by the way. And she's taking him to court for everything he's got. Custody, assets. You name it. Evelyn stumbled back, as if the words had physically struck her. Marcus, you didn't. I did, I said firmly. And don't think for a second that you're walking away unscathed. Our prenup? It has an infidelity clause. You lose everything. Evelyn. The house, the cars, the accounts, they're all mine. You'll be left with just enough to start over. Wherever you end up. Her mouth opened, then closed, as though she couldn't form the words. For the first time in all of this, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. She wasn't just worried about losing me, she was terrified of losing the life she'd worked so hard to build. And just so you know, I added, my voice sharp, the ticket to Granite Falls? That's not a suggestion. It's a one-way trip. Evelyn. By this time tomorrow, you'll be out of this house. Permanently. She collapsed into the chair again, her head hanging low. Marcus, she said softly, her voice barely audible. I loved you. I still do. Loved me. I said, shaking my head. You didn't love me, Evelyn. You loved what I gave you. The security, the status, the freedom to pretend you were something more than what you've become. I walked to the door, pausing just long enough to deliver my final words for the night. You wanted to feel important? Well, now you are. You're the cautionary tale everyone in our circle will be whispering about for years. Then I left her there, alone in the wreckage of her choices. The morning after our confrontation was unervingly quiet. Evelyn didn't come out of the bedroom while I sipped my coffee and went about my morning routine. I didn't expect her to. She was probably in there frantically calling lawyers, trying to salvage whatever scraps of her life she could. It wouldn't help. By the time she emerged, her once flawless composure was gone. Her face was pale, her hair unkempt, and her eyes red from crying. She carried a single suitcase, the one she usually used for business trips. It was fitting, in a way. This was just another departure for her, except this time, there was no return flight. Marcus, she began, her voice hoarse. Please, let's talk about this. I'll leave for a few days if you need space, but don't make this permanent. We can work through it. I stood in the doorway, blocking her exit, the weight of her suitcase between us. This isn't about space, Evelyn. This is about accountability. You've lied to me, betrayed me, and humiliated me. There's nothing left to work through. She started to cry again, though it felt more like a performance than genuine remorse. I don't deserve this, she said. I made mistakes, but I don't deserve to lose everything. I raised an eyebrow. Mistakes? Evelyn, a mistake is forgetting to pick up milk on the way home. What you did was a series of calculated choices. You don't get to play the victim now. She flinched at my words, her tears slowing as she realized there was no room for negotiation. Where am I supposed to go? She asked, her voice small. Granite Falls, I said simply, gesturing toward the envelope on the counter. Your train ticket is in there. I also called your parents. They're expecting you. Her eyes widened in horror. You told them? Of course I did, I said. They deserve to know what's been going on. And if you're looking for sympathy, don't expect much. Your father wasn't exactly thrilled to hear about the mess you've made. She shook her head, her voice rising in panic. This is cruel, Marcus. You're sending me back to that miserable little town to face their judgment? To live in shame? I crossed my arms, my expression unwavering. Cruel? No. Evelyn. Cruel is lying to someone who loves you. Cruel is making a mockery of your vows. You don't like the consequences? Then you should have thought about that before you acted. Her hands tightened around the suitcase handle, her jaw clenching. For a moment, I thought she might throw it all back at me, fight me tooth and nail. But instead, she straightened her back, the remnants of her pride propping her up. Without another word, she grabbed the envelope and stormed past me, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. The door slammed behind her, and the sound echoed through the house like a final punctuation mark on our life together. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. She was gone. That afternoon, I received a call from her father. He didn't mince words. I don't know what the hell she was thinking, Marcus, he said, his voice gruff. But I want you to know, she's not walking away from this scot-free. She'll be held accountable. I thanked him, not because I needed his validation, but because it was oddly comforting to know I wasn't the only one who saw Evelyn's actions for what they were. As for Evelyn, I could only imagine what awaited her in Granite Falls. A modest childhood bedroom, her mother's disappointed tears, her father's simmering anger. She'd traded a life of luxury for a one-way ticket to shame, and it was all of her own making. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange, bittersweet sense of peace. The storm had passed, but the aftermath was just beginning. Evelyn's departure set off a chain reaction I had prepared for but hadn't fully anticipated. The social circles we navigated weren't known for their discretion, and by the end of the week, whispers about her affair were everywhere. I didn't need to say much. People connected the dots quickly once they received those anonymous packages with all the evidence. At first, I avoided the phone calls. Friends, colleagues, even mutual acquaintances were reaching out, their voices tinged with curiosity, pity, or thinly veiled satisfaction. People love a scandal when it's not their own, and Evelyn had just handed them a feast. But I wasn't interested in gossip. I had bigger plans. Meanwhile, Leo's life was unraveling just as I'd intended. Vanessa, his wife, didn't waste time. She filed for divorce within days, citing infidelity with all the accompanying evidence I'd provided. She called me once, not to thank me but to confirm what she already knew. I suspected for months, she admitted. I just didn't have proof. You've given me what I needed to protect my kids. It wasn't satisfaction I felt when I hung up. It was something quieter, heavier. A grim acknowledgement of the destruction Evelyn and Leo had caused, not just to me but to innocent people caught in the crossfire. Leo's job didn't survive either. By the end of the month, he was let go after an internal investigation revealed inappropriate use of company resources. I made sure that the details of his meetings with Evelyn, paid for with corporate funds, were impossible to ignore. When I heard through the grapevine that he'd moved out of his home and into a friend's spare room, I allowed myself a small, bitter smile. Actions have consequences, after all. Evelyn, meanwhile, was silent. The Granite Falls ticket had been more than symbolic, it was her reality now. Her parents, traditional and deeply conservative, weren't the type to sugarcoat their disappointment. I'd heard from a mutual acquaintance that Evelyn's father had made it clear she was on her own until she earned back some dignity. Knowing how much pride Evelyn had, the thought of her enduring that kind of humiliation didn't bring me joy. It brought a sense of finality. Still, part of me wondered if she truly understood the depth of what she'd lost. The penthouse was eerily quiet without her. The smell of her perfume had faded, her clothes were no longer hanging in the closet, and the housekeeper's routine no longer included tidying Evelyn's endless collection of accessories. But instead of feeling empty, the space felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. One evening, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Trips we'd taken together, holidays spent laughing over inside jokes. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness. This wasn't the life I'd imagined for us. But then I reminded myself of the lies, the deceit, the utter disregard she had shown for everything we'd built together. This wasn't my failure. It was hers. As I closed my phone, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Evelyn's betrayal had broken something in me, but it had also set me free. Free to rebuild, to start over, to create a life that didn't revolve around someone else's lies. The ripple effect wasn't just about destruction. It was about clearing the way for something new. And that, I realized, was the ultimate revenge. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly began to settle into its new rhythm. The chaos Evelyn had unleashed was still a topic of conversation in our circles, but I had become an expert at brushing it off with a polite smile and a well-timed subject change. People seemed to respect that, perhaps even admire it. Dignity in the face of betrayal was something they could talk about at their dinner parties, after all. Evelyn, on the other hand, was nowhere to be seen. Word trickled back to me through mutual contacts that she was still in Granite Falls, living with her parents. Apparently, she'd taken a job at a local boutique to make ends meet. The woman who once draped herself in Hermès and Louboutins was now folding sweaters and ringing up sales for people who barely recognized her. The irony wasn't lost on me. Leo's downfall was even more dramatic. His wife, Vanessa, had taken him to court and cleaned him out, winning sole custody of their children and the house. He was reportedly living in a dingy apartment on the outskirts of the city, picking up freelance gigs to make rent. I didn't lose sleep over it. As for me, life was unexpectedly good. I focused on my work, threw myself into new projects, and even started reconnecting with old friends I'd neglected during my marriage. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for myself, not for an image or a relationship that had turned toxic long before I'd realized it. And then there was Rachel. She was a litigator at my firm, sharp-witted and fiercely independent. We'd worked together on a few cases, but it wasn't until after Evelyn had left that I really began to notice her. She had this way of challenging me, of calling me out when I needed it, but always with a warmth that felt genuine. There was no pretense with Rachel, no games. She was the kind of person who made you feel grounded, even when the world felt upside down. Our first date wasn't planned, it just sort of happened. We'd stayed late at the office, going over trial prep, and when we realized it was nearly 9 p.m., I suggested grabbing dinner. What was supposed to be a quick meal turned into hours of conversation, laughter, and a connection I hadn't felt in years. 6 months later, our relationship became public, and it was surprisingly freeing. Where Evelyn had thrived on appearances and manipulation, Rachel was the opposite. She was steady, supportive, and unflinchingly honest. When our engagement was announced in the papers, I didn't feel the pang of loss I thought I might. Instead, I felt hope. Evelyn, of course, saw the announcement. I knew because she sent me an email, the first communication from her since the night she left. It was short, almost cryptic. "I hope you're happy. I'm sorry for everything." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. Evelyn was a chapter in my life that had ended, and Rachel was the beginning of a new one. Looking back, I don't regret what happened. Evelyn's betrayal had been a painful wake-up call, but it forced me to see the cracks in our life, and in myself. It gave me the strength to let go, to demand more, to rebuild. Justice had been served, but that wasn't what healed me. What healed me was realizing that my worth wasn't tied to Evelyn's choices, her lies, or even her love. It was tied to how I chose to move forward, and for the first time in a long time, I was moving forward with purpose. The view from the other side was breathtaking.